And if possible, remember to try not to stream the YouTube live video unless you absolutely have to. And if you do, make sure it's muted because I will generate an infinite audio loop. But yeah, we're now live on YouTube. So just wait for a few more minutes and then we can start.
Sounds good.
Yes, did we figure out we have you back online?
Sorry?
That sounds better.
I think it's Jens maybe you were referring to, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm afraid that it might be the same, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But it works. It works.
Yeah, we
I'll
can
see.
see it.
I'll find some pillows and put around me. That might help. 2 seconds.
Fernando?
Yeah.
I guess no offense to you, Stan, that your video should be off, right?
Yeah, I can do that.
And maybe, I don't know about your own as well, or would you like to keep yours on?
I can stop it too.
Okay.
Okay, we have lots of people coming in. I'm gonna start meeting them.
Good luck, everyone. Break a leg.
You too.
Oh, thanks.
So it is now 10 and we have officially started, but I think we may be interested in waiting 1 or 2 minutes to see if more join. And then I will introduce the event and me and so on.
We have like 25 people on YouTube as well.
That's awesome. Hi, YouTubers.
But I still don't see YouTube, so wait a second.
I'm so sorry, but Fernando, can you quickly be on the chat and answer Stan? We cannot begin before you do that. Thanks.
I did it already.
Good.
I think we could get started now.
Yeah. All right. So welcome everyone. Thanks to those that have joined on Zoom, and thanks to those who are joining on YouTube. My name is Louisa Nilsson, and I work as a researcher at the Globe Institute. And the Globe Institute is a recently created new institute in the Faculty of Health and Medical Sciences at the University of Copenhagen. So the main purpose of our institute is to address basic scientific questions where we use interdisciplinary approaches. So it's a very diverse institute. And we therefore operate at the intersection of natural and medical and sciences and the humanities. I am the moderator of today, and my co-moderator is Michael, who will now introduce our event and himself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Beauregard. I'm an associate professor at Globe Institute, working mainly with island biogeography and large-scale ecological patterns. And also, I'm a member of the Sustainability Committee on the Globe, which is the committee that focuses on how we can advance more research and more teaching on sustainability at the Institute, and also on how we can make our day-to-day work more sustainable. So we do a lot of research that's very sustainability focused, and we believe that we actually have a possibility and also an obligation to take the consequence of these research results, and also to help with giving information out into the public in a political subject that's as loaded as this one is. And this event is part of that. So the main background for this particular event here is that we are in a period right now of great social movement towards change. And a lot of that change is actually driven forward by some scientific realizations that the current culture that we have is unsustainable. So that means that science is now placed really at the center stage of global society in a way that we are not used to having it. And then at the same time, we have activist grassroots groups that are pushing for change from the bottom, so to speak. The thing is, can these very different perspectives interact? Should they interact? What are challenges and possibilities? So we've invited a number of representatives for the leading edge of the science part of the things, and a number of representatives from the, you could say, very active and leading edge of the activist side of things for a panel debate.
So before we move on to our lovely speakers, I will quickly talk about the format of today. So everyone listening on Zoom or YouTube can, during the speakers, write questions. On Zoom, you can write questions on the chat. You can also use the function under participants, where you raise your hand. That's a blue logo. And on YouTube, you can, on the comments, write your questions. So we will not, during the speakers, be asking questions, but between each speaker, we will try to ask some of the questions you have either written on YouTube or the Zoom chat, or if you have raised your hands, we may go to you and you will then have the words to ask your question to the speaker. Also, I would like to quickly repeat the schedule we have of speakers before going back to you, Michael. So first is Catherine Richardson. Then we have Jens Friis Lund. We have Caroline Besserman and Team van der Loer. And we will, of course, briefly introduce each before they speak. So Michael, you will now do that with Catherine.
Yes. So Catherine Richardson maybe doesn't really need an introduction. She's a professor of biological oceanography, specializing in plankton, and in particular how biological systems like plankton drive the larger biogeochemical cycles that characterize this planet. So her work in sustainability is she leads the Copenhagen University's Sustainability Science Center. She's been chairman of the Climate Council. She's a lead author on the UN's recent assessment report of the Sustainable Development Goals, the first of this kind to come out after the Brundtland report. She advises the Danish government directly. She's instrumental in driving research on planetary boundaries that come out in the biggest international journals and set the stage for other researchers. And she's also one of the professors in Denmark that's most often quoted in the media. So we're really happy to have you here, Catherine. You can start now.
Thanks very much, Michael. I honestly didn't get the impression that this was an offer I could say no to, but I'm also delighted to be here. And of course I would say yes. But I would like to also emphasize that I got into this business, I guess you kind of led the way into it, absolutely from a science side. And activism wasn't a part of my, or wanting to do anything about sustainability wasn't a part of my vision at all. I fell in love with phytoplankton. I fell in love with those tiny little plants in the ocean that are so small you can't even see them with the naked eye. And for the first half of my career, people accused me of wasting public monies for researching something that nobody could ever be interested in. And then they realized that these tiny little plants in the ocean were actually very crucial to how the Earth system works, what makes it go from ice ages to non-ice ages. So that makes them very important agents in climate. So suddenly I'm political in all of my research because I studied these little plants that have something to do with climate. So I went from being accused of wasting money on something uninteresting to being accused of wasting money on something political. So that's basically my career. But in the process of all this, I got involved in some international work, which gave me the opportunity to see my wonderful little plants working in the Earth system. And I became completely enamored of how the Earth system works, that it's the interactions between biology, chemistry, people, and physics that actually decide. It's not the climate, it's all those interactions that decides what conditions we have on Earth. So that's really what I consider myself now. Even though I have a professorship in biological oceanography, I consider myself an Earth system scientist. And because people are part of the Earth system, this gets very political and it can be used in activist circles. So I'm coming into this completely from the science end. And as Michael said, I was appointed by Ban Ki-moon to an independent group of scientists to kind of do an IPCC-like report about global sustainability that came out last fall. So that's my science, that's how I got into this. But I'm absolutely passionate that we humans have to take responsibility for our relationship with the rest of the planet. I mean, I think our ancestors realized when they stopped running around after their food and we started living at a fixed address, I think they started out by throwing their waste wherever it was produced and by taking whatever they thought they needed to survive, food and something to burn to get energy. And then they realized they were getting sick from polluted water. They were running out of trees. They were running out of animals to eat. So they had to make some rules about how we deal with the local environment, our relationship to the local environment. And I think what's happening now is we're realizing at all levels of society, not just in science, that we need to make rules about how we're going to relate to the planet as a whole. And that I'm passionate about, and that's emotion, and emotion soon becomes activism. So I'm very much looking forward to pursuing this discussion. How do you balance the need to be completely clean and scientific and objective with the emotion and the passion that I do feel about this need. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Catherine. Just a quick question, follow up to your talk. So you're talking about the Earth system, what you're really interested in, the Earth system. So how big is the Earth system? Does that include the social system of humans?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we talk a lot about tipping points in natural systems in terms of ice melting and you know, the Gulf Stream, the heat coming from the Gulf Stream changing the AMOC term. But in fact, social tipping points are just as important. And we do see social tipping points. We saw social tipping points. Sometimes it's technology that drives it. Like when we went from being on having horse-drawn carriages to having cars. Sometimes it's morals. I mean, it's or our own health. It's the smoking or putting seatbelts in cars. These are all social tipping points. And one of the things that I hope very much for is that this what we're seeing with activism at the moment and this bottom-up movement will be driving. I mean, science in itself can't drive a social tipping point, but activism can. And maybe the combination of activism and Corona can make a social tipping point go really, really fast. So in my more optimistic and happier moments, I think maybe we're living in the middle of a social tipping point, but we just can't see the forest for the trees.
It's a very exciting perspective. So just to give our next presentation, or the next speaker, that's Jens Friis Lund. And he's a professor of what's called political ecology. So he has a special focus on global change and on social inequality. And he's also founder of the or Omstillingsrådet and the Danish Scientist Climate Network. And he's one of the professors that's most actively engaged in the public debate in terms of focused applied research that feeds directly into debate, but also in terms of active debate and media outreach. So welcome, Jens.
Thank you so much. I hope you can all hear me. And thanks a lot for giving me the chance to be part of this today. I'll speak a little bit about my own position on the kind of role of science and the kind of current political struggles over sustainability that we're in. And I like to use the term kind of political struggles as I find the term activism tends to carry kind of unfortunate connotations. This term seems to kind of convey a sense of strong-headed idealism, and not least the will to force through one's ideals. And many might see this as kind of out of place or even radical, in particular in Denmark. But I think the people that I meet who are often labeled activists, to my mind, they're simply citizens, fulfilling a key role in nurturing a democratic ideal in which connections to power and money is not a guarantee that your political preferences will be the one that carries the day. So I actually like to talk about active citizenship as opposed to activism. Anyway, so my own engagement as a citizen, an example of that could be that what was called the Forskernes Klimaopråb that I was part of 3 years ago. So I'm just going to share this screen for a second so you can see what that was all about. There you go. For those of you who don't know it, Forskernes Klimaopråb was a manifest that was published on the front page of Politiken in May 2018. So this was before the dry summer in Denmark. It was before the school strikes. It was before the major people's climate marches in Copenhagen. It was before the 1.5 degree report from IPCC. And it was before the Danish climate election. So at that time, actually, there wasn't that much debate about climate in Denmark. And I think the debate that was there in the public was kind of portraying the climate emergency in somewhat comforting and maybe distant terms, not something we had to do anything about right now. Tended to portray Denmark as a global green leader. And it also tended to say that green growth is a way forward. And I think we're still in that green growth moment, so to speak. So I think that the tendency at that time was a very poor reflection of what we know from science. And I think science at that point indicated three things: that we had runaway climate change, an urgent need for rapid decarbonization to avoid tipping points, and to avoid becoming dependent on a massive global scale rollout of negative emissions technologies that are risky, expensive, or even geoengineering. And I think that science at that point also could tell us that Danish society and Danish lifestyles had one of the highest climate and ecological footprints across the globe, far from sustainable, as you indicated in the beginning, Michael. And I think science also told us that there's no indication whatsoever that the necessary emissions reductions to meet the Paris Agreement goals could be had on the continued growth in production and consumption globally, but therefore maybe particularly in Denmark, right, given that we are already living with such a high climate footprint. So we came together as a group of researchers and wrote this, and we were around 15 people who were actively engaged in the text. And the process revealed broad agreement on what we could call the facts, but a lot of uneasiness and disagreement with how we would present those facts and what would be the lessons that we could draw from those facts. So for instance, many in the writing group were quite uncomfortable with the suggestion that this correlation between growth and production and the climate footprint pointed towards the need to kind of rethink society, maybe reduce work hours, as opposed to increasing pay and consumption possibilities as productivity for workers would increase. Anyway, in the end, around 300 people signed this manifest, and that kickstarted a debate about both the content of the manifest, but also about the role of scientists in public debate. So that's maybe where the relevance to this comes in. And in terms of content,
Jens, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but people have written that they cannot see the article. So is it possible for you to tap again with your mouse or try to share it? Yeah, now it's on. Thank you so much. Sorry for the interruption. Continue.
Yeah, no, I think I'm seeing my text then. I'll just stop sharing. Anyway, you've seen it now.
No, it works now. No, they couldn't see it. So please let it stay and continue. That would be great.
Can you still see the text?
No.
That's the problem. I have my notes, otherwise I can't remember what I'm supposed to say. Anyway, I'll stop sharing. You can see me instead then.
That's even better. Continue.
Okay. Anyway, in terms of the content of this manifest, so Danish industry, the agricultural lobby, even the government at the time said that this was plainly wrong. So they, were, not agreeing with the facts that were in this text. In terms of the role of scientists in public debate, some argued that not all of the people who signed up were climate scientists, real climate scientists, and therefore they should not have signed. And others argued that the manifest was just an expression of politics, not science. Still, none of what we wrote was actually new or very contested results within the disciplines where we drew the results from. Still, you had Danish economists arguing implicitly against what we said on the relationship between growth and emission reduction requirements. So it was a very interesting experiment, I think, in this engagement between science and what we call here activism, but I would call it active citizenship with that. So I think what we can learn is, first of all, that scientific results do not just flow into society to inform policy. Media, people's cognitive biases, politics simply imply that some science will not be heard unless it's pushed or pulled into the public realm through interventions such as what the Forskernes Klimaopråb was an example of. I think secondly, we can learn that there is no one science that we can appeal to. Another example of that is that the IPCC, for instance, publishes emission scenarios that rely on massive amounts of risky / maybe speculative net negative emissions in the second half of this century, allowing for a delay in emissions reductions in those scenarios and still maintaining the 2-degree or 1.5-degree goal. Yet, for instance, the European Academy of Sciences, in a report from 2 years ago now, strongly states that we cannot rely on such a rollout of negative emissions technologies. So I think for these reasons, because climate change is such a fundamental challenge, it's such a potent threat, in particular to those who have the least connections to power and money, I believe that scientists have a special responsibility to engage in a democratic debate, but also to call out silences or biases in such a debate, and to do it in ways that both build on science, but also has a keen eye to whose interests are served by your version of science. So I hope that this is a slightly provocative input to this debate that we're going to have, and I'm looking forward to discussing this more. Thanks.
Thank you, Jens. And yeah, just to remind everyone, after all of our speakers, we will have Q&A, so that's questions and answers. But again, feel free to write questions during the speakers in the chat or on YouTube. So I have a question. Thank you so much for presenting your work. So how is it to be potentially criticized for what you have done of research and you believe is, reliable and everything, but yet there are someone being super critical and always trying to pin it down? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so of course it's it can be tough, and I don't know, but I think that that's maybe also why some scientists refrain from this, even though they can see these silences or biases in the public debate, right? Because scientists are incredibly dependent on a wide belief in their legitimacy and integrity. We don't have money or power, but we have that authority. And if that is questioned, that's of course a very, very threatening situation to be in. So it's threatening, and it's of course uncomfortable. And but I think, as I said, I think there is a need to maintain a democratic society and democratic debate. There is a need also for scientists to engage in this. or to work with people who are willing to go out and take the beating in the public realm. But I think the idea that we can just sit and publish research articles and then those articles will somehow seamlessly flow into society in an appropriate way, I'm not sure I believe in that. I think it takes a little more engagement.
Thank you for that answer, and I agree. The next speaker is from Den Grønne Studenterbevægelse, the Green Student Movement. And it's a student-run organization focused on addressing the climate and biodiversity crisis in Denmark. They are in the forefront of the initiative, the demand that the government divest from fossil fuel, initiatives like the Baltic gas pipeline, the inclusion of Denmark's indirect emissions in its carbon budget, and the enactment of a biodiversity law. They have organized numerous of protests and online events to call attention to the climate crisis in these recent years. So now I give you the word, Caroline, and you can fill in. Thank you.
Sure thing. Thank you so much for the invitation. My name is Caroline Westerman, and I am 22 years old. I study international business and politics at CBS. Usually, and then I'm also here today because I'm an active part of the Grønne Studenterbevægelse, the Danish Green Student Society. So I'm just going to share my screen with you guys because I have some slides I would like to show you. And this is just going to be a presentation of our movement. So let's see here. We were founded in 2018 by students across higher educational institutions, and we are an action-oriented community of mainly students who are all working through a palette of different activisms to underline like a common climate responsibility and the need for structural and institutional change in order to urge and accelerate a green transition of our society. So we are an independent and democratic movement with no party political affiliation. And we want to voice concerns about the importance of acknowledging the pressure that is facing our ecosystems and the planetary boundaries. And we mainly do this through mobilization of citizens to join in a just green transition on all levels of society. So therefore, we are engaging in a lot of initiatives on many political levels at universities, in terms of unions, in the media, and in local and national policies. Yes, I would like to outline what exactly we fight for, and hopefully that will give you a look into what we actually do. So first of all, we want to engage and gather youth in and around the climate political debate. So we're not exclusively students, but a great percentage of our active members attend a higher education. And that's because it's largely our future wherein we will see this crisis unfold. So we aim to promote active participation by young citizens. And we do this, we have several different local branches in places like Aarhus, Aalborg, Silkeborg, Haderslev, Odense, and Copenhagen, of course. Secondly, we are fighting for collective political solutions to the climate crisis rather than an individualization of climate responsibility. And that is because we know that the change that is needed to counter this crisis will happen on all levels of society. So the individual, of course, play a great role, but we firmly stress the importance of structural and institutional change. Because we believe that it is on those levels that we can see the real and rapid change that we need to counter the crisis. Thirdly, we want to challenge the current dominant paradigm regarding economic growth towards an alternative that can raise democratic participation and can exist within the planetary boundaries. So this means that we stand critical regarding the status quo on economic growth. So modern economic growth happens at an expense of ecological health and global equality. And I know that this might not be directly linked to what we're discussing today, but it might be relevant when considering why climate science might not get the reach and create the change one might hope for, because there sometimes is a very dominant clash of interests. Fourth, we fight for a Denmark with policies that align with the Paris Agreement, IPCC reports, and the most recent and updated climate and sustainability research. So we want to live in a country that coexists with the scarce resources that we have on Earth. And we believe that politicians, scientists, educational institutions, and other decision makers play a key role in helping us arrive at this. So it is a shared task to prioritize climate action, and this should always be linked in accordance to the Paris Agreement and updated scientific research on the topic. So that is why I am happy to talk about it today. Fifth is that we want Denmark to take international responsibility and lead the way in terms of a greener future through responsible and socially just climate policy. So Denmark carries a huge historical responsibility regarding our previous and also our current emissions and the role contributing to climate change. And we think that we need to own up to this. We also need to consider the groups in our global society that might be the most vulnerable to the consequences of climate change, because I think we own them to take the role that is given to us, that we hold. So, and sixth and lastly, we aim to encourage Danish educational institutions or higher education to prioritize climate and sustainability regarding the aspects that can be everything from physical facilities, as well as curriculums and scientific research, because we see a great potential in starting to reprioritize on how we deal with climate change through education and learning. And I think this is where this to a high degree is very crucial. So now we've been on this slide for a long time. I have gathered a small selection of the work that we do. And firstly, of course, we do demonstrations and protests. So we are involved in arranging and facilitating a range of climate marches and demonstrations, for example, the People's Climate March each year. So another initiative that we see happening is what is going on at the right of the screen, and that is Operation Klimahandling, or Operation Climate Action, that takes place every week, where groups of people protest in front of different ministries. So here on the picture, we have a group standing with the Minister for Building and Housing, Kåre Dybvad. And so these are different scales of protests and demonstrations, but that's all, like all of them are something that we are involved in arranging and facilitating. Next up, we also formulate the green demands for our higher education, and we just launched our 8 demands for Roskilde University that students can go and support through a petition to encourage the administration of the university to make changes to both the campus and the curriculum. So that's also something we do. Next, we have podcasts. We have a little group of people from DGSB who also makes these podcasts. Right now we have 2 current podcasts. The one is called Green Frequency and the other one is called Quarantine Catastrophe. And they dive into the topics like activism, wildfire, sustainability, or sustainable construction, the ecological crisis, and so on, to try and spread the word about these topics and kind of make it understandable for common people who are just interested in understanding the topic of climate and climate change. So that is a way we do that. We also have just launched our blog. That's what you see to the left. And of course, we have some media presence where we voice concerns, participate in debates, stuff like this, to actually say what a group of young people or individuals who care about the climate actually thinks about these things. Yeah, so we comment on everything from future climate actions to current climate related issues. Yeah. Then we also make citizens initiatives. So we have contributed to a range of them, and what you see on the left is regarding the initiative for a Danish climate law that was last year and received the 50,000 signatures that was needed to be presented in Parliament in only 13 days. And that also helped, we want to believe that it also helped mobilize the pressure to get the climate law of 70% reduction in 2030. And on the right, we have a newer initiative that is about green construction in the building sector that we also launched. Yes. Lastly, I have included some of the digital initiatives that have started during this lockout. And so on the left, you see the virtual Monday meetings that we do in order to stay connected, that activists maintain this motivation that this fight is still relevant. That is hugely important when we are isolated and the main topic is Corona, and on something else that we don't forget the fight. And on the right, we have the climate stream that we've done in collaboration with Concedo. That is an educational course for students in high schools on science and democracy and activism. Yeah. So that was just a little look into what we're doing. This is also a visual about some of the working groups that we have. We have a lot more. I just wanted to show this to kind of visualize in terms of all the different directions that we in DGSB work, and you can be a part of something and then know that there are countless and countless initiatives happening at the same time. So this is just a little look into how broad that palette of activism actually is. So in terms of, this is the last thing, in terms of today, I think the collaboration between science and activism is really, really important, because the restructuring of our society for it to be able to coexist with the scarce resources that we have on Earth is a democratic one. And this means that we should have as many people engaged and take part as possible, supported as possible. And I think here sustainability, science, and activism should go hand in hand, because science gives us a framework that helps us in our activism in terms of providing kind of the empirical foundation and data, and that we need to convey the urgency of a green transition to understand the consequences, the objectives that we formulate from that. And so simultaneously, we spread the message and the main conclusions of climate-related science as activists to make it available and understandable for the broad population. I think this is where we also play a role, which in turn hopefully gathers the support for sustainable initiatives, and also have people understand the importance of independent scientific bodies. Yeah, so that was all I had for my presentation, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Caroline. That was super interesting. Just a really quick question. So you, in your presentation, you focus a lot on climate, but I can see also that in some of the slides that you are touching upon many other aspects of the relationship between humans and society. Right. So do you see the climate as sort of the carry-all thing that affects all the other aspects? Or do you have some other kind of shared model for how these different crises interact with each other? Or are you mostly a climate-focused movement?
Well, I wouldn't say we focus a lot on climate, but I think it was mentioned before that we also focus on biodiversity. We also focus on nature. We also focus on all of this being socially just. So that we're not just putting climate up on a pedestal and saying, let's do this and let's get this through and then forget about all other aspects, because or at least I think that all of this is very interdependent. So there are a lot of topics that will have to go together and that we have to consider in order to solve these, like the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and all of that. So that we ensure that, like, let's say economic inequality doesn't just ramp up and get out of hand as well. So yeah, it's a lot of different disciplines. It's not just in terms of climate.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Caroline. That was great. So our next speaker is Tiam. He's from Extinction Rebellion, which is a global movement based on civil disobedience that demands that the governments tell the truth and act on the climate and biodiversity crisis. Its Danish branch has organized numerous non-violent direct action events to call attention on these crises, including a recent demonstration inside the Danish parliament and a 24-hour blockade of Holmensbro. So now to you, team.
Thanks for that introduction. And first of all, of course, thanks also to the Globe Institute and everyone who's been involved in organizing this event. So I'm Tim, I'm 21, and I study a Master of Science in Climate Change at Copenhagen University. But quite the opposite of Catherine, I was engaged in the climate movement, and that's why I've gotten involved in climate science or climate change research and not the other way around. I've started being active in Extinction Rebellion in the Netherlands when it just started at the end of 2018. So also the Forskernes Opera that Jens presented, then also Extinction Rebellion wasn't around yet, I would like to add to your talk. In Extinction Rebellion, what we really do is we take the science as the starting point. So the Earth system science that Catherine and so many other researchers produce, these insights they produce, we take that as our starting point, and we actually say, wait a second, if we just look at this science very objectively, then what we can see is that we are in a very dangerous situation. And this refers to some of these tipping points that Catherine already refers to. We are actually in a kind of situation where we don't know, or we are at risk of society as we know it, the world as we know it, not surviving for very, very long. Doesn't mean that it has to happen, but there's this risk. And this is because of the climate crisis, but also because of the biodiversity or the ecological crisis. Next thing we know is that this is not such a crazy new insight. This is not something we discovered last year. This is something that we've been quite aware of for decades at least. And the governments around the world, including the Danish government, have not done enough about this and was helped bring about this situation. So this brings us in a situation where we are in a situation where we are at risk, at the kind of risk that we don't want to be in at all in terms of the climate crisis, in terms of the ecological crisis. And we know that governments have been ignoring this for a very long time. And this is actually what justifies, or what brings about the necessity, I would say, to do nonviolent civil disobedience. So we say we have the right and actually the duty to break laws, to disobey the government, and in that way to bring about the kind of shift that we need and the kind of change that we need. And as you mentioned, the strategy of choice is then nonviolent civil disobedience, and this is something that has been tried and tested across all continents, across many centuries. Famous examples, of course, include Gandhi, Martin Luther King, also many anti-dictatorial movements, anti-nuclear movements, environmental movements, also over many decades. And what we want to reach by doing nonviolent civil disobedience, so for example, by getting many people out into the streets, blocking places, or getting into parliament, is, like you said, first of all, to have the government speak the truth, tell the truth about the climate and ecological crisis. So be honest about the kind of danger that we are in. Second of all, to act now and to stop the emissions of greenhouse gases, but also the destruction of biodiversity as soon as possible. And the third one is also to engage citizens directly in this process. So we also say that for so many decades we've been producing this situation, and apparently the kind of machinery we have, the kind of political system we have, the kind of economic system we have is unable to handle this situation, is unable to bring about the kind of action that we actually need. So we want to, or we need, I would say we need to change the political system to engage citizens more directly and in that way produce solutions that are more systematic. And so we've done many actions to bring this about. Extinction Rebellion is biggest in the UK, but also in other countries, mostly in Europe and in the Western world, or in the global north, I should say. So bringing together thousands, tens of thousands of people to block, for example, the center of London, or here in Denmark, to block Holmen's Skål, to go inside Parliament and take your clothes off. So these kind of provoking actions to kind of shift what we think is possible. About shifting what we think is possible, we would often say that acting now means we need to produce wartime-like efforts, but I think now we can say, actually, we need Corona-like efforts. So what we've done to Corona, where we say, wait a second, this is such a dangerous situation and such a big crisis that for a second, it doesn't really matter anymore. The impossible is possible. We just shut down our schools. Actually, we should think quite similarly about the climate crisis. I would say, of course, shutting down our schools doesn't really help solving the climate crisis, but we can say, okay, wait a second, this is such a big crisis that we just need to stop flying until we find a solution for flying. And we're going to restructure the entire society as soon as possible until we find a solution for this problem. About Corona, of course, this means that we need to rethink our tactics a little bit. Civil disobedience often, but not always, but often includes many people gathering outside, protesting together or doing actions together. And this is not really responsible anymore. So we're also trying to adapt to this. Next week, we're actually coming up with a series of actions. So definitely stay tuned for this, because we are going to go outside in the streets and protest in a responsible way. So thank you very much.
Thank you, team. So I was thinking, and this is a bit of a personal question, but I hope you do not mind. Since you're doing a master's in sustainability and you're very interested in sustainability, also working in this nonprofit organization, when did you personally begin having interest in sustainability?
So like I said, I think I was engaged in the climate movement before I became interested in climate science or in earth science. This is, I think, 3 years ago when I was studying, and actually my roommate started becoming involved in a Dutch climate movement called Code Rood. And so that's how I kind of rolled into it. And then I started taking courses in a course called System Earth. And then, then I got more and more into it.
That's cool. I was interested in if there was a specific event that did it, but there doesn't.
Okay, I remember the 2018 COP. I mean, this is maybe very nerdy, but I also remember the Global Carbon Project, and then the number came out about CO2 emissions rising 2.something% in 2018, and then we were all just sitting there like, how is this possible, right? Because we've just been to these protests, and this is actually often a frustrating experience. If you're doing both of these things, that you've been to these protests, you've seen all these people rallying, and there's so much energy, and then you go home and you read the science and you read, okay, we've just had the biggest increase in carbon emissions ever, right? And there's this big contrast, and there's this big gap, right, between what you think there's momentum for. You see, I don't know how many thousands or millions of people on the streets, school striking, and then you go and you look at the numbers and you look at what's actually done, and it's nothing, right? So that's definitely a moment that I remember.
Yeah, that was a motivating factor for you to really get into it. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you. Those are 4 really great introductions. So I think it's time we launch the panel debate, and there's already lots of questions clicking in on the Zoom chat and on the YouTube chat as well. So there are lots of interesting questions to start with. I think just to start up the discussion, we'll start with maybe talking about what initiated this whole idea. So we're seeing in the presentations here 2 different descriptions of the relationship between the scientists and the activists. So On the one hand, you can say we have Catherine and team who has this image of the scientist that dispassionately or maybe passionately produces the science, and then that science feeds into the activists, and the activists go out and make real social change from the bottom based on the science that's being presented. And then on the other hand, we had Jens's point where he says, well, we are all active citizens. A scientist is also an active citizen, and we are not going to get the science out if we don't, as science, engage more actively in getting it out there. So these are two different models or images of the relationship between activism and social change and the science. So I'd like to ask the panel, and maybe we could start with Jens to hear, what do you see, what are the advantages and pitfalls of these different approaches?
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think so. I think also to nuance this, it also depends on what you're doing and what kind of science you're producing, right? Because some science is in very high demand amongst what I, in a very rough and ready way, call people who are close to power or money, right? So if you do something on innovation, if you do something on new mobile technologies, maybe there's a big demand for your science. But if you are interested in sustainability and keenly observing how notions of higher productivity and growth-inducing policies are at odds with sustainability, there's maybe much less demand for your science. So I think how you as a scientist must operate in that also depends on what you do.
Catherine, do you have a point to that?
Yeah, I do actually. I mean, I think we want social change here. And social change happens when you get a large number, when you get a majority of people that are behind it. And I think what we're maybe forgetting in part of this discussion is the fact that not everybody gets persuaded by the same kinds of arguments. And it's what changes people's minds is when their tribal leaders, the people they look up to, are leading them. And look at, I mean, Greta Thunberg is wonderful she's a role model for young people, and she has a tremendous effect. But you wouldn't send Greta Thunberg in to speak to my husband. I mean, it wouldn't work. So I think we have to be aware that just because you don't go on the street and join activism doesn't mean that you're not trying to deal with a certain segment of society that I mean, when I was the chair of the Climate Council, or the climate policy thing from 2008 to 2010, at the end of the day, we came with a report that said, listen, it's going to be cheaper, or at least not more expensive, to switch, to get rid of fossil fuels. And then people from activism were coming after me and saying, but do you really believe there can be a growth rate of, because we use the same growth rate as what the finance ministry was projecting? And I said, no, I don't. But if I choose a different growth rate, then I'm going to spend my time debating with people in the finance ministry about why I use a different growth rate. So I accept their growth rate to make my arguments. And if you can do it with a fast growth rate, then you can do it with a slow growth rate too. And they just wouldn't buy it. And at the end of the day, I was selling out because I was using this high growth rate that the finance ministry was working with. And I said, finally in desperation, I said, listen, you try and change the world your way, I'm going to try and change the world my way. And, activism speaks to a large number of people, but it doesn't speak to all people. And if we're going to get all people a part of this, then I think there has to be room for sympathizing, but not actively participating in the activism on the street, but trying to do activism behind the scenes in a different community.
So Caroline, your point on this, so seen from the activist's point of view, do you need the scientists to engage more? Or do you agree with Catherine that the scientists can participate the most by staying, independent?
I think largely you should always do activism where you can and where you reckon that it has the most influence. So I would never advocate for that everybody should do activism in the same way, that you needed to be on the streets and kind of like take a certain type of activism. That's not really, I don't think that would be very productive, because as Catherine says as well, that doesn't speak to everybody. I think generally it is very, very important that scientists kind of keep their legitimacy. So like climate denial is not as big of an issue in Denmark as somewhere else, as in the US. And I'm very grateful for that, because science has this sort of legitimacy. At the same time, it is also impossible that science just like fade into the background and is some sort of a passive player who just spits out numbers, and then people can use these numbers as they wish. Because scientists are also sometimes asked to give recommendations, and they're also very qualified to do so. And I think as scientists, you should also, you know, dare to be controversial, and if you get results that are somewhat controversial, you should let them speak, and also speak your mind about how you arrive there and what you get and how you interpret those sorts of results. Because I believe that science is political, and it is highly politicized anyways. So it is very important that I think scientists work in both arenas of activism and science, but it might be very, very important to disclose what sort of arena you're working within, if that makes sense.
So scientists should be honest about their results, but they should not become too associated with activism, is actually your point as well. So Jens, that seems to contradict your point before, or could you comment just finally on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree that obviously as a scientist, you should not, misrepresent facts. Absolutely. So obviously that's super important. And so far, I don't think I've been, blamed for saying something that had no foundation in science. And I'm very happy for that, even though sometimes the way I say it is unconventional, because I'd like, as Catherine is saying, to reach other audiences than the ones we normally reach. But I definitely, obviously, I mean, we cannot, as a scientist, you should not speak in the same words as people writing text for signs or posters when they go on demonstration to demonstrate. There is a difference, absolutely. I don't know if that hits what you were getting at, Michael.
I think it hits it more or less. So just to bring this close to where we are, I mean, here in the Sustainability Committee, there was this climate march for science. And then we debated, do we send around a message to everyone at our institute that now we should go in the street and protest for climate action? And of course, this led to a discussion, well, do we end up being pulled into a situation where a climate scientist or a scientist that works on something related to global change, which is, I think, a valid word, is that people think, well, that's also just a part in the case. For instance, the climate deniers group have been very effectively at framing the IPCC as a part, even though the IPCC is extremely careful on trying to stay impartial. In the same way, Bjørn Lomborg did the same. And there was also this case with the University of East Anglia, where the climate meteorologists were based, that had their emails hacked, and those were circulated in the global society and used to undermine the scientific case for action on climate change. So that it's in that kind of context that I'm asking: do we end up being counterproductive if we become associated with being a part in the case as scientists?
I think Catherine wants to say something, so I'll let her start.
Yeah.
I think absolutely you should send the message around that there is this opportunity, that there is a demonstration. Every scientist is also a part of society, and every scientist has a right to make a statement. It's usually the political scientists that think they have a right to be the debaters in society, but no, every scientist has a right to do. But then every scientist has the responsibility to think about what audience they normally, I mean, I, for example, have many times been asked to speak to the Fridays for Future as a speaker there in front of the Parliament. I am, because I sit in the Climate Council, an advisor to the government. I don't feel that I can both be an advisor to the government and then stand and support people that are demonstrating against it. As much as my heart wants me to do it, I think that's going to make my voice, it's going to weaken my voice in the Climate Council. So I make the decision not to do it. But I want very much to know that that's going on. And so I think everybody should have the opportunity, but then everyone has to get the decision about whether or not they want to participate.
Thanks for sharing that, and thanks to the rest of the panel for also giving their opinions on this. Now, I will try to bring in the audience, both from Zoom and YouTube. So to just follow up on the discussion we just had, I see that Ole and Armando in the chat of Zoom agree with the term of climate scientist, that we should make sure that the media do not use it. At least that's their opinion. And now to other opinions and questions from our audience. We have one specifically from Jenne Liburt. She asked it over YouTube, and it's to you specifically, Jens. So she asks, how do you see latent collaborative opportunities or potentials for engagement for sustainable development between sciences?
So not between science and other publics, but between different disciplines?
Yeah, I think that's how you're supposed to understand it.
Yeah, no, I definitely see a potential there. And I think that one of the things someone also wrote about, what does funding and university structures do to our way of working and stuff. And I do think there is an issue that we're all so busy producing papers, teaching and whatnot to uphold our career in the competition with peers, that sometimes I think we lose sight of what are the larger problems that we're dealing with, or at least there's not a clear incentive to sit down, let's say Catherine and I and an anthropologist, a sociologist and a historian, to talk through what are the fundamental societal problems that we're dealing with, and how is issues around the management of oceans linked to the management of trees, and how can we understand that in a larger historical perspective of social change, and thereby be part of or contribute with knowledge about the change that we think is important. So I do think that there is a big untapped potential there, but I also think that there's a lot of obstacles to meet that potential, because of the way that our universities are increasingly structured around the competition for funding and the incentives to work on your own and to specialize and to focus on the realm of academia as opposed to the realm of the real world. I'm a little critical towards that, and I think it would be very interesting to have a discussion about that. I wonder if that's the discussion we need to have here, because the focus here was about activism and science, but I'd love to have another seminar like this that focused specifically on that.
Yeah, I'm sure we would like that too. Hopefully we will see if it can be organized. Just quickly before I go to another question, does anyone in our panel have something they would like to comment on this? Catherine, maybe, or?
Yeah, but I mean, other people need to get on too. I mean, I think one of our major problems in terms of all of this is the fact that when we talk about researchers, most researchers and most funding for research is about looking at things. And really what we're realizing, if you want to make change, is you have to change interactions. And nobody's really studying those interactions. And I think much of science now is actually realizing it's interactions that are important. I mean, who would have thought that your gut flora were 10 years ago, who would have thought your gut flora was so important for your immune system and your psychological state? So it's all about interactions. And yet a large proportion of money comes from companies. They don't look at interactions. They look at making their products better and sell them better and more. And a lot of government money goes to research that's going to support those companies. So nobody's looking at these interactions are paying to understand these interactions so we can change them, and they're going to be societally different. So what we discover in Denmark about interactions isn't going to work when we want to change societal structures in Africa or in Asia. And so we have a huge dearth of research in the area that we really needed if we want to change the world.
Yeah.
I might have a point on this too, if that's all right.
Yes, absolutely. Fire away, Caroline.
I'm not really that much into funding of research and stuff, but I definitely see the danger that I think both Jens and Catherine are talking about in terms of trying to get funding. And it seems like there is sometimes a need to please certain agendas in terms of getting the funding and not being too controversial in what you study, as well as there is a tendency to get that a lot of funding gets funneled into topics that are trending. And that is good for climate change right now, but we might have known more if we hadn't had the kind of let's fund trending topics, let's say 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, where climate change wasn't as popular. So I think that is definitely a point on that. And so we need to maintain this high degree of independence in science and also research on things that might not seem directly linked to it, but can for sure be linked to it, because as I talked about earlier, everything is interdependent. So a lot of different science, a lot of different studies and fields can tap into each other. And I think that's definitely a need for that. Studying at CBS, you definitely get in the mindset of businesses and how they invest, and that it's very aimed towards getting certain results, and that is effective, but it's also very, very narrow. And I think that is why we need more public funding, because public funding is some sort of democratic funding as well, because it's everyone pitching in of taxpayer money. But through that, we also need people to understand why science and this type of sustainable science is important. Yeah.
Maybe I can bring this back a bit to the climate movements, because I actually think that's also the debate we have in society, and this is of course framed to a big extent by people that are active citizens, by people that engage themselves in the politics, and this determines to a big extent what we're gonna be funding, right? So are we gonna, and what we're gonna be researching? So are we going to make scenarios that find how we're going to be carbon neutral in 2070 as Shell does, or are we gonna develop scenarios to be carbon neutral in 2050, or are we gonna find scenarios to be carbon neutral in 2030, right? So these are these big questions, and there's a certain push also from the climate movement to do research on certain things that we think are important, right? So to stop doing research on how we can extract more oil, for example, and to start doing research on how we can be carbon neutral as soon as possible. So science is never neutral, right? And not only the companies decide what we do research on, but also us, the movements, decides what the research is on.
So in your view, the best engagement of a scientist is actually not to become directly engaged, maybe in activism or in communicating science, but it's in selecting what topics to research?
No, not really. I would love, actually, maybe more than anyone else in this panel, I would love to have more scientists on the streets, and I would love to have Catherine on the streets. And I don't think this will actually cost legitimacy of science. I think there have been many scientists who've tried to stay very objective, to carefully avoid engaging themselves in politics at any cost, and this hasn't really helped create legitimacy of science. And I think more recently, where we've actually seen the climate movements using the science and using the IPCC reports and drawing political conclusions from the IPCC reports, that we've also seen that finally this kind of research has gained more legitimacy, right? So I don't think we can fight climate deniers of whatever gradient, right? So I would say green growth is a form of climate, of denial. I don't think we can fight climate deniers of any kind just by writing papers, but actually by engaging in the public debate a lot more and a lot more actively.
Do you have a point for that, Jens?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that I completely agree with what Tim is saying here. There is no neutral or objective science. If you spend your whole life studying geoengineering versus studying the possibility that we don't need geoengineering, your knowledge will train other people's attention in those two different directions. We just need to be aware of that. We just need to take responsibility for that. We need to constantly, as scientists, think about acknowledging that we cannot foresee the future. No one can, right? No one is a magician in that way. So we cannot know the consequences of our actions. Yet with that, still we need to consider what the things that I'm spending my time on, the knowledge that I'm putting out there as scientific outputs, is that likely to lead to further delay in decarbonization, or is it likely to accelerate decarbonization? And what is it that I, as a scientist, want to produce in terms of knowledge?
As a comment to this, we actually have a question from the audience from Thijs, who is a professor studying geoengineering. And he's
Hang
asking,
on there, Michael, because I think he would actually have the guts to ask it himself.
Okay, let's get him on.
Let's put him on. And I also quickly want to say to everyone who have asked questions on YouTube and Zoom, we have noted them down and I will read them out loud, or Michael will. There's just a line of people. So please stay tuned. Thijs, I'm gonna start your video. Unless Fernando has done it. I can't seem to find you now. Ah, awesome. Hey.
Hey, thank you very much. Actually, I think my question was answered already by Jens and Catherine. I tried to provoke a little bit, of course, because, I mean, many of these things that you touch is that, I mean, we are not actually fully objective when we pick our research areas. And I mean, the thing is, I'm not a political scientist, but much of this, I mean, the solution lies in implementing it. As somebody said in the chat, we already know what to do, and we already know that it's possible to do. It's a matter of money and it's a matter of will, as far as I can see. And I'm extremely scared about the some of the alternatives, solar radiation management, things that can be launched by a rich nation. So that makes me say that we should, I mean, invest in direct air capture. I see Ole John is apparently a researcher working on this topic. So that's a subjective call, and I'm happy to support this, but I'm not doing this myself. I'm just reading what everybody else is doing and just basically, what do you call it, yelling in the choir together with you. Should I do that?
Can I respond?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, no, Thijs, thanks a lot for engaging. And I think what you're saying is just is such a good reflection of maybe what I talked about earlier, this need for more time and investment across scientists in talking about these things, because maybe you and I seem to have a quite similar thoughts on these things, but that might not be the case. Maybe sometimes when I meet people who work on these technologies from a pure engineering perspective, they are not very observant necessarily of the potential political ramifications of their work and political interpretations of their work, which people who come from political science or who come from anthropology might have a keen understanding of. And I think the conversation between those two disciplines then could really produce something that could be very, very interesting as an output for public debate. And I would love to see much more of that. But I just think it's difficult for us as individuals to do it because we're all boxed into this system of the university. That's at least how I perceive the university today.
Thank you, Jens, for adding a comment there. Do you want to answer back, Thijs, or do you feel alrighty? Thank you so much for asking your question. So I have another question from the audience. This is from YouTube and it's to the entire panel. It's quite long, so please hang in. The first question is, and then it continues, what about conflicts of interest? Professor Lund, Jens, indicated that scientists are usually independent, but each time that there is a publication of sustainability, for example, of food groups, there are other scientists that come up with a clever analysis or spin pointing to something else. Last year, there was the so-called meat scandal, where a report had to be withdrawn, someone fired, and this due to unhealthy practices muddling the credibility of scientific research. How do we keep credibility as scientists within the current financial research funding schemes?
Yes, I think it comes back to what I was talking a little bit about. I think there is some unhealthy incentives structures in current academia. There is this race to publish. There is the race not only to publish, but also to get cited. The more you publish and the more what you publish is cited, the better your chances is to get the next grant and thereby to grow your career. And things that are cited are not only things that are wonderful contributions, it's also things that are provoking or things that, you know, create a new twist on something, as you say. And I would love to see an academia that was more collaborative and less competitive. I think potentially we could produce better things in such an academic environment. And maybe that's where academics' activism should also lie. Maybe that's what we should be talking about. Maybe we should talk about unionization as a way to push back on the individualization of us as scientists and the competitive environment that we're being subjected to. Because maybe it's not productive and maybe it's not healthy for what we're doing. I don't know. Those are just my thoughts. You can hear that I'm, you know, almost a communist here. I'm talking about unionization and whatnot.
Team, are you also a communist? No.
Am I a communist? I wouldn't call myself a communist. No, but I would like to. I mean, it seems to me also very kind of an uneven playing field, right? So, I mean, the meat industry is, of course, a very good example where there's big industries that have a lot of money and a clear interest in selling the story that meat is sustainable or healthy, for example. And on the other hand, there's activist groups. And the moment scientists engage themselves with activist groups or with social movements, then they risk being vilified as not neutral, as being not trustworthy, and so on. And on the other hand, we have this big industry, and we know that, for example, oil companies have paid for publications, right? That say climate change isn't real, or that say that they have a role to play in the future, basically. And this is a very accepted kind of way of influencing science. And the moment that, and at the same time, we hear Catherine and we hear many other scientists who are hesitant to go out in the streets because they fear will harm their credibility. So this just seems very uneven to me. Like, what, you know, we are fighting against some of the most powerful corporations, some of the most powerful institutions there are, and we need scientists on our side, very bluntly said.
Thank you for that, team. Actually, we also have a question specifically for you and Caroline. It is asked by, let me see, Andreas Engholm through YouTube. The question is there a risk that team, so the Extinction nonprofit organization, becomes too radical to have traction, and that the Green Student Movement becomes too moderate to pushing for the necessary change? I don't know who wants to start, but Caroline, team.
I can start. I think that's a very clever question. At least it's a question that try to box the two movements in terms of how we do activism, and I don't even think you can say that that is a very narrow definition. I wouldn't say so. We choose to do activism remotely different, I would say, if we talk in those like general lines. But as Catherine touched upon earlier, this also speaks to different audiences. And besides that, a good thing in terms of being a movement and being an organization is that the input you get into the organization forms the work that is done. So that will say that If you think DGSB is very moderate, that is, as of right now, like things change. We're very dynamic in terms of how we work and what kind of input and projects are being done. I wouldn't say we're too moderate at all. We're somewhat realistic in a lot of our approaches. We're trying, as Jens touched upon earlier, not to be these activists who are deemed as radical and not identifiable. And we are just citizens who actively are taking part because we can identify an issue that is in our society. And we don't want to alienate that from other people who also want to take action. So I'm sure if you had to step into at least the movement I'm a part of, you would see a large variety of different people. And that is because that it is a movement for everybody, and everybody can take part no matter where you're from or what your opinions are. For the most part, like in general, we have the same opinion, but I'm sure if you had different representatives sitting here today, they would put it in different words or frame it different, or maybe even disagreeing with me on some points. And I think that is very important to have an inclusive movement that can gain some momentum. So I wouldn't agree with the way the question is leading, unfortunately.
That's fair. So we are sort of slowly leading towards the end of the meeting. We'll end within the next 10 or 12 minutes. But I have just want to sort of collect all of this. So we have you here as representative for the activist movements, and you are requesting that the scientists engage more. And then we have two scientists who are among the people who know the most about this. And actually, of course, the scientists aren't chosen for this panel because they have certain opinions about climate change. It's actually or sustainability as such, it's actually almost impossible to find someone who knows so much who has a different opinion, because the science is fairly clear. So there are people here who are deeply concerned and of course want to help, and team is saying we need the scientists on our side. So the scientist clearly is on the same side as you can speak, but the question is, if you were to decide, if you ran the universities in Denmark, or could just, how would you have the scientists act, also remembering that if the scientists lose credibility, then that's the whole basis of what your work builds on? Question to both of you.
Can I go again, Tim? I will let you speak afterwards. So I'm not sure I fully agree with what Tim says about scientists actively having to take part and standing on our side, because I'm a little bit afraid that might have the same effect as when big business pay for publications, where we're creating some sort of polarized picture of either you're on this side or you're on that side. And science is no longer what we can refer to as, okay, this is our common framework. This is what we can see in terms of scientific conclusions that we have to somewhat deal with no matter what side of the debate you're on. I think in picking sides, that you can do that, because as we've talked about, scientists are political beings, citizens as well. It's all up to you. I'm just saying that I wouldn't urge it as much. I don't think you should be dispassionate about what you research in, but I'm not certain that there is the very strong need for scientists to be activists the way we are activists, because that would sort of meddle with some sort of credibility and legitimacy. So if I was, your question goes on, if I was in charge of universities, I would, I think most of all, just make sure that the independence was kept for scientists to study what they would like to study with the methods that they would like to study, and just providing the financial aid that they need to do and conduct those studies. Because if I started to put my political agenda on top of science, just like big business does, just like big investors does, then that skews the science towards a direction, towards a political agenda that is mine. And we walk away from science being somewhat objective and somewhat neutral, and taking a stance that is in between party lines. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for that careful answer. So we'll let team answer as well. And then we have 3 more questions from the audience, and then we'll start wrapping up.
Okay, I won't make it too long then, because we don't have so much time, and 3 questions is a lot. So yes, I do think I have a bit of a different view on this. First of all, I think, you know, big business, what they did to science, it has harmed science, and it's been very good for big business, right? So buying publications, unfortunately, it has just worked, and there's some damage done that needs to be repaired, and it needs to be, you know, repaired actively. I also think that often, unfortunately, still scientists have to fight to be heard, right? So we've had people highlighting the risk of climate change in the 80s. For example, James Hansen has been one of the first climate scientists to do so, and he's had to, you know, go out and get himself arrested I don't know how many times, and finally the message arrives. So it's and also, like Jens says, it's not like we write papers and then automatically, magically the message arrives where it needs to be heard. So yes, if I were in charge of the university, if I were in charge of the higher educational system, then yes, I would encourage researchers to go out and make sure that whatever they have to say is actually been listened to.
Okay, so here's a bit of a switch. Have anyone in the panel, raise your hand if you have, watched the documentary or movie that's called A Planet of Humans by M. Moore? Team. Okay. Maybe you will be the one answering this, but it is to the entire panel, so feel free to comment or ask the question. It's asked by Ikolo Kuomens. I hope I pronounced your name correct, otherwise I'm sorry. He asks here, I recently watched A Planet of Humans by M. Moore. There he presented renewables as useless. His solutions to climate crisis was population control and to stop producing based on profit. What do you guys think? Jens?
It's a perspective, right? So at least the solutions part. But if you take, as far as I haven't seen the movie, but I've seen a lot of debate about it. And as far as I understand, the examples that Michael Moore uses are, you know, hand cherry-picked examples of old technology in places where it doesn't function. And there's even apparently some manipulation of some of the things. So it's completely outdated, non-scientific. The facts are just not corresponding with state-of-the-art science, as far as I understand. In terms of solutions, yeah, of course, depopulation would probably work pretty well. But that's where then the kind of, you could say, multidisciplinary aspect comes in, and the kind of notions of what values do we want to pursue? Do we see that as a good solution? Because another solution would be to say that we stop flying and driving in cars. That'd probably be as, a good solution as depopulation in terms of climate mitigation, but with a completely different outlook in terms of human rights, et cetera, and whose lives would be in jeopardy, right? And whose livelihoods would be in jeopardy. So I think that movie is an interesting example upon which to discuss the production of climate denial in different forms, and also discuss the different very fundamental values that are often part of the climate debate, such as eco-fascism, eco-modernism, climate justice, etc. And often you can see the disagreements in the climate debate fall along these lines of very fundamental values, as much as on disagreements about the science, I would say.
Thank you, Jens. Now to Catherine.
Yes, it's really very interesting, this population thing. I give about 100 popular lectures a year for non-academic communities about this. And usually they're people on their pension, they're retired people. And they always say population control. And they think population control is about making women in Africa not have babies. In fact, the rate of birth, the fertility rate globally has been falling dramatically. What's giving population growth is the fact that some of us aren't willing to respect our expiration dates. It's the extension. It's 2 things that do population numbers. It's how many come in, but also how many go out. And we're not leaving So people don't realize when they make these arguments that in fact we're talking about saying the corona is a wonderful thing. Let's get everybody to die, and then we'll be all set. And in terms of the renewables, nature shows us that, you know, when you have limited resources, if you just focus that one bacterium in a jar, it'll grow very, very quickly, and then it'll run out of resources and ultimately die because it gets poisoned in its own waste. Ecosystems, because they reuse, recycle, and regenerate their nutrients and their resources, they can exist forever. So we've got a lot going in the reuse argument.
Thanks, Catherine.
I think this, because I have seen the documentary, and I think it's an interesting one to talk about, because it might be taking this thing of, you know, weaponizing science for the climate movement a bit too far. And it is because, like also Jens says, a few issues are brought up, but discussed very at the surface. For example, there's a very real discussion to be had about what is sustainable, what is renewable, how renewable is renewable energy. We still draw on the resources. You know, solar panels are still made out of finite resources. This is a very, you know, interesting scientific debate. It doesn't automatically mean that solar panels are bad, right? It just means that we need to take a good look at our energy mix. We need to take a good look at the way we produce solar panels and the way we get rid of them. Yeah, and the population thing, I thought that was a bit painful, that scene, because that's obviously one very particular perspective on this whole issue. Should we reduce the population, or should we reduce our consumption? And you can't go out and pretend that science has proven that we need to reduce the population, because it has not, and it cannot.
Thanks, team.
Yeah, these questions definitely led to some really, really interesting debates. What do you think, Louisa? Are we taking a final question?
Yeah, I was thinking, since we're running out of time, we have one final question, and then perhaps lastly, we should let the panel have any last remarks. I at least would love each panelist to give one advice that we as caring citizens can do to battle climate change. But I will get to that later. I think we should have the last audience question, and it's from Andreas Engholm. It's asked over YouTube: what science can the humanities, psychology, sociology, etc., contribute with to increase or accelerate the mental shift? Caroline, maybe you were nodding. Do you have?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because you can say that the natural science has been around for ages, and we've known that things were going south from, I think, the 80s. But a lot of the barriers that we're fighting with as activists, for example, are people's mental notions of where are we and what is needed and how urgent is this even. And I think the psychological aspects, political aspect, I think sociological aspects, was you mentioned, are so important in terms of how we as humans take in the facts and developments and current and rapid social change, and how do we adapt to that, and are we willing to adapt to that? And there is sometimes an unwillingness, because status quo can be quite comfortable for human beings. So I think it's to understand, why is it that why are we not moving faster? Why are we not transitioning at the speed that we are told that we need to transition in? I think a lot of it is due to people's perceptions and the perils of perceptions. And I think this is where social science can play a huge role in terms of this debate.
Can I super quickly add? I think there was a great example under the COVID situation here in Denmark. A couple of political scientists quickly came in and advised the government on how it communicated to people in the wrong way, how they needed to communicate in a different way to actually achieve the things the government wanted to achieve. So social change, there are some fundamental rules, there are some fundamental things we can think about, and And I think that was an example of how it can contribute.
Thanks, Jens. So if the panel don't have anything else to add to that last question, I think we should end with a statement from each. And please, if possible, incorporate in your last statement your one advice for us citizens to potentially do to battle climate change and the biodiversity crisis we're having. Thank you.
Who starts?
Yeah, who would like to start? We can start with you, Jens, maybe. Your microphone is off.
All right. So I think for all of us, I think we're all citizens and we all have a responsibility for the society we live in. The society will only become the society we want to live in if we engage and are part of shaping it. We can't just be workers and consumers. We need to be citizens. For scientists, I think we need to organize to change our institutions so that they can become more fostering of the things that we actually want with science. And I think tenured people and professors in particular, pointing to myself, should carry the brunt of this work. I mean, we are the ones potentially with the most job security here, so we should be the ones leading the way in that process. Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Jens. Maybe Caroline, you're next.
Sure thing. I think active participation is key. Ownership is key. And the feeling of being part of something bigger is key as well. So in 20 years, when this part of the crisis, this part of the development will be merely history, I think I would like to have people do a little task of thinking, how will I want to remember the role I played in that? Did I take an active role, a passive role? What would I like to tell my children about what we did today that affects 10 years, 20 years from now? Just doing anything. I'm not here to tell you how you should do activism or active citizenship. That is all up to you. Everybody has different lives and different platforms, and you can do whatever. But just taking a stance in all of this is very important. And I know for me, I was concerned about climate change for a long time before I became a part of DGSB, but having that as a forum for to not feel hopeless, to have that community and have that solidarity amongst each other, that we do this as a team, we do this together because it concerns all of us, was really helpful. So if it's helpful to you, find some of these communities. If it is helpful to you just to know that that you can do it on your own and do activism in the arenas that you are that you are in, do that. And I think lastly, as Catherine said at the beginning, falling in love with science is great. And I hope that more people will do that. I also hope that science will become more accessible to everyone, understandable to everyone, scientists as well, and as non-scientists, because I think that will take us far.
Thanks a lot, Caroline. Over to you, team. Then you can.
Yeah, first of all, thanks. I think we all engage in our own different way in this big problem, and of course, I'd really appreciate whatever way people engage in, and I think it's a really big step forward that we're sitting down and having this discussion and talking about what is the right way to engage, even if we have different views. And then I think my advice, or what I would like to say, is that really don't be afraid of being too radical or too ambitious or dreaming too big, because this is very big and the situation we are in is not normal, and to an extent we need radical. So at the risk of being a bit cheesy, I just want to quote Gandhi, who said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. Right? So even if you're being ignored or if you're being laughed at now, like, don't be afraid, because we can win this.
Thank you so much, team. And lastly, you, Catherine.
Yeah, in terms of what we all can do, I think it's important. I think it's actually, we should be very wary of this stop flying, stop eating meat, stop, because I think there's a tendency to, oh, well, I didn't eat meat, so I can go out and buy new clothes now or whatever. I think we need to, in another way, actually realize that are, I think society is in the process of changing its understanding of its relationship to the rest of the world. And ever since we've had satellite pictures that show the Earth from space, and you can see that this Earth isn't going to get any more resources when we've used the ones that are there. We're in the process of adapting to not everybody's in the same place right now, but it's moving. And 20 years ago, the cutting edge of science in all this was talking about climate, but the people on the street weren't. And 10 years ago, they were talking planetary boundaries. And now at the cutting edge, you're talking system thinking. But the top of the curve, the normal curve, has gotten to climate. So it's like everything's about climate. This isn't about climate. This is about our having limited resources that we have to share. And so I think the most important thing is that we all treat our resources in the same way that we treat our money. None of us would use more money than absolutely necessary to buy a good or a service, and yet we all use more resources than are necessary to maintain our lifestyle. And if we had this sort of money approach to our resources, I think that would help a lot. With respect to universities, I've been bashed a bit for not going to the street, but I've done an awful lot of written activism, and I actually in 2 different cases, including the Times Educational Supplement, I've come with manifestos. I've been part of manifestos that have asked universities to call the climate and biodiversity crises that we're in for an emergency. And in some countries, they have done that. In Denmark, the universities have ignored us. But basically, my argument is that nothing is more important than training the students that we have to be able to deal with the societal challenges that they are going to meet. And that means that every student, whether they're studying dentistry or whatever, every student should be have the opportunity to understand these crises. So I do believe we have very, 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 very much more to do at universities, and we're not accepting the responsibility that should be ours.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. That was a good ending comment. Michael, I don't know if you have anything to say, but I want to quickly state that I'm sorry we went a bit over time. Thank you to everyone who have been viewing this on either YouTube or Zoom. Also a huge, huge, huge thanks to Fernando. You may not see him or know him, but he has been the one organizing all of this mainly. So big thanks to him. And he's there. Hi, thank you, Fernando. And I think that's all for me. So unless you have something to add, Michael, I would say just again, thanks to our panel, thanks to those listening, viewing, and thanks to Fernando.
Yeah, that's all I wanted to say as well.
Perfect then. All right, we hope to do this again with another topic virtually later on when we can, then maybe in person, we'll see. But I think we're ready to close it up.